All right. So next we're going to talk about supply chain performance metrics. We'll start off by I'll do a little exercise with you on visual management. That's always a fun topic. We'll talk about why it's important to use metrics. We'll cover some common metrics, and then I'll list a few strategies for you on what seems to work best when handling metrics. So, I'd like you guys to play along with me here, uh, and we're going to walk through a visual management exercise here. So back in 2015, UK met Ohio State at the first game ever at a place called the Barclays Center up in Brooklyn, New York. So these are some photos from the game. So I want each of you to kind of pay attention to these photos as we go through. So first, Alex Poitras throwing down a monster jam here. Next up, we've got Scal Labissiere with a big block. Very good defense there from him, as well as Marcus Lee. And Marcus with a putback jam, which he was known for pretty well. A guy named Jamal Murray, who seems to be tearing up the NBA now. He's hitting a jumper here. Good form there, right? Alex is roaring, right? That's always a good sign. Anytime players are pumped like that, right? So here's my question for you. You are the coach of this basketball team, UK, and this is what you're observing. How do you feel right now? Hopefully pretty good, right? I mean, everything you're seeing here is positive, right? So now let's look at what actually happened. So this is a graph of the game. Red line is Ohio State, blue line is us. They stayed ahead. Ooh, we got really close, almost caught up, but we lost. So we lost that game by 7. Some of you probably already knew that, which is kind of sick that you would remember that game from a few years ago. But that's what actually took place, right? So the actual mood of the UK coach was that right there, right? So what was the problem? Like what is the gap that we're missing here, right? So the problem is we had a perception. The perception was based on the things we saw, things looked really good, right? Versus the reality, right? That is the gap. This is a good quote from Nielsen. He's actually the guy that did the Nielsen ratings, or does, his company does today. So the price of light is less than the cost of darkness. So what we were really missing was the score to the game. That example, I showed you the highlights, but you weren't really looking at the score to the game, right? Which probably seems so obvious when you think about sports, but when we apply it to business, let's walk through this example now. So now you're not the coach of the basketball team. Now you're a manager in this office, right? So let's walk around and see if we can observe some behaviors. So first off, we got this guy clearly scratching his chin, thinking about things very intently. That's good, right? Next one, we've got some teamwork. Looks like they're doing like a Google image search or something there, maybe. I don't know. But they're working together. That's a positive, right? So clearly there's some teamwork and collaboration happening. That's good. These guys all seem to be intently focused on what's in front of them. No one's obviously getting hurt at the time, right? So what is your mood walking around this office, right, or this workplace? If you listen to the basketball example, you know you can't know what your mood is, right? Because what we're missing is, like, what is the score to the game, right? So in the workplace, there's a few questions that you should be asking yourself as a manager, and you should be attempting to answer along with your team. So the first thing, what are we working on? Like, what are our goals for today, this week, this month, this year, et cetera? And how do we know, like, the things we're trying to do are actually things getting us towards those goals? And then secondly, now that we know what those goals are, how are we actually doing on those goals today, right? We've set some objectives. Are we actually achieving those things, right? So this, again, I'm sure you guys are like, this is the most obvious thing ever. Why are we talking about this? Most companies don't operate this way. Most companies, you show up every day and it's like, well, I know I need to do this and I know I need to answer emails. I guess I'll just do that, right? It's all open-ended. Everyone's kind of moving at their own pace in their own direction. There's very little cohesion or coordination across resources, right? So the tool or the version I'm trying to talk about is basically visual management. So you're trying to figure out, how do you know what's actually going on? What's the score of the game in your organization? Does your team know and understand what the score of the game is, what they're being scored on, what the company's being scored on, etc.? So those are kind of the two big questions that need to be answered when we talk about visual management. Visual management is essentially making processes and performance visible to the team, right? So quick question here as we dive in on what that could look like. Why should a company use metrics? So just kind of think to yourself again, like, why would you possibly use metrics? So here's a couple reasons. Number one, it's a cold, objective measurement. You have to have some of this stuff in place. Any type of process, you need like a time or a goal that you can say, did we hit this or did we not? Were we on time? Were we not? Anytime you get people involved in it, it's like, well, I kind of know why we were late, so I'm not going to count that as late. Well, but it was late, right? And that needs to be measured, and then we can improve upon it. Next up, a common language for communication. I would roll out new metrics to my team, and it was amazing. Like within 2 days, they would be talking that language. Like, oh, this is our focus. Okay, let's use that language around the office as we're working. It also gives you some kind of baseline for kind of improving down the road. So what are the things, like as soon as you start measuring something, like, oh, okay, now I know where we're at today, and now I know where we need to get to, so I understand kind of that gap in between. It's really, really helpful when you're trying to explain a goal to the team if you can quantify that goal. Don't say we want to improve quality. Say we want to get our quality to 99.9%. Like, okay, well, we're at 95, so now we know what we need to do, right? It also focuses your efforts on a very small list of objectives. That can be dangerous, and we'll talk about that on the strategy side. But you're really kind of laser focusing the team's efforts on a very few specific objectives instead of kind of the ubiquitous list of do a good job for all customers or whatever. It encourages accountability. That can be a frightening word, if you work at the wrong type of organization. But in a positive organization, that accountability is actually a good thing, because that means you can now take responsibility for fixing things as opposed to pointing fingers and all those kinds of things. And it also can help generate some small victories. I would say in my top 3 list of most rewarding experiences in my past life at LeanCore, one of them was just taking a really poor performing process that was just not in a good place from a customer perspective. They were not happy with us, and we spent over a year slowly chipping away at that process and making it better and better. And to see the momentum, like, it is technically like project management and goal setting, but it's almost more, it's like a change management or a people motivation type situation where you're trying to get people on board. By the end of that year, as the process was improving, you couldn't stop the team. Like, they were going to achieve the bigger objectives, right? So it was really cool to see that happen, and you realize, like, wow, if we set this up correctly, you give that team a little momentum, and then they're going to take it on themselves. You don't have to keep driving that focus. So those are a few reasons to use metrics. Now let's look at a couple pretty common supply chain metrics. The first one, this is called perfect order percentage. This is a pretty theoretical one, but it's also helpful to kind of understand at a high level what we're looking at. So basically, we're looking at how many orders came in and were processed and were shipped and delivered without any issues, right? So error-free orders divided by total orders. So it could be really specific to a particular process, or it can be like a total system measurement. That's the more common scenario. Is across all of our processes, how many went through without a hitch, right? If you can improve your perfect order percentage, you're going to cut way down on rework. You can cut back on lead time for processes. You don't have to deal with the rework. And it also improves your customer perception. So your customers feel like you're more reliable and hitting targets, right? So an example here, let's say you had 3 orders with missing piece prices out of 100. That would be a 97% perfect order, right? Or 2 orders with missing part labels out of 50, that would be a 96%, right? Or if you had 5 out of 150, right? Incorrect. So 145 out of 150. That is probably about 97%. Next up, we've got, sorry, I have to do the math. It's 96.7. Okay. Next up, you have fill rate. We've talked about this one before, basically which orders were on time and in full. I'm sorry, I'm going to make one more point real quick on the perfect order. This is not used, like you're not going to put this up on the wall and say, what's our perfect order percentage? What's most commonly done here is you'll use the perfect order percentage to find which of these sub-processes were causing the biggest problem, and that's when you're going to dive in and focus on that process. It's very rare. Perfect order is theoretical. It's kind of like a consulting technique. Let's observe the process at a high level, realize how bad things are at a high level, and then zoom in and figure out where we're causing most of the problems. So it's more, I would say, theoretical or strategic than it is like a daily metric. Fill rate, on the other hand, is highly tactical. It can be used daily for sure. The impact here, obviously, your customer service improves. If your fill rate's better, your transportation spend is more in line because you're running trucks efficiently. So an example here, if you have 85 complete out of 100, it would be an 85% fill rate. Inventory days on hand, there's a few different ways to calculate this. But the most common would just be what is your inventory available divided by your average daily usage. So that tells you, if you have 100 units on hand and you typically use 5, your inventory days on hand would be 20, right? It's used mostly on the manufacturing side, some on finished goods order fulfillment, and it has a massive impact on your cash flow, right? So the more inventory you have, there's a lot of money tied up in that inventory, right? Somebody's paying for that. So an example here, another one here, if you have 1,000 units on hand and you use 100 a day, your inventory days on hand would be 10, right? 1,000 divided by 100. Inventory turnover, this, again, a high-level metric. What is your cost of goods sold divided by the average inventory? And that's typically like a balance statement or balance sheet value there. So it is another system level. You can't really get into the details of it because you're measuring that average inventory maybe quarterly or monthly, but certainly you've got an annual figure that you could use as well. Again, huge impact on your cash flow. So an example here, if you had 50 million in sales in 2015 and your average inventory was 2.5 million, so your inventory turns would be 20, right? Which it could be really good. Depends on industry, right? Now let's say your average inventory went up to 5 million. Well, suddenly your inventory turns are down to 10, right? That means that 10 times a year you're turning over your inventory. And some of that stuff is never getting turned, right? But your goal should be to get that inventory turn high enough that cash flow is not an issue when it comes to inventory. One of the biggest concerns here is at the end of the year, a lot of companies, because it is a hot button issue with investors, something they're going to pay attention to, especially with manufacturers, a lot of companies will bleed out their inventory at the end of the year and try and demonstrate, hey, our turns are really good. Like, no, you just killed a bunch of your inventory, you wrote it off, or you sold it at a discount. So what most companies do to counteract that, or most, I guess, watchdogs do, is look in non-peak seasons to figure out, what is the average inventory throughout the year, not just a week before everyone knows the auditors are coming, right? Cost per pound is typically a transportation term. Basically, how much did you spend to move a certain amount of weight? So obviously the transportation process is the big impact here, and it has its largest impact on spend, transportation spend. It can impact sales if you're charging your customers a markup for that. So if your transportation is more expensive than a competitor's, it could actually impact who they buy from. So an example here, if you spent $16,000 last week to move 160 pounds, you spent 10 cents per pound, right? So this metric is really good to look at the same network over time, but it's actually really dangerous to try and measure it across companies and certainly across industries, right? So the cost per pound to move foam that goes inside of seat cushions for a boat, considerably higher than the cost per pound to move flat pack boxes from IKEA, right? Because they're very dense, you can fit a ton of them on the truck. It's going to be a very heavy truck, right? So cost per pound is kind of meaningless when you compare across those two examples, right? But if you look at IKEA's cost per pound today versus, Q1 of last year, that's very applicable, right? Because it's very similar network, so you can see if you've improved or not. Last one here is trailer utilization. So basically, how much space did we use on the truck versus how much was available? A huge impact on transportation spend. So an example would be like 25 spots on a truck with 26 spaces available. So you can put 26 pallets and you've only used 25 of them. You're up over 95%, right? That's really good. I used this example earlier in the semester. There is a point where you don't want to go to with trailer utilization, where you're filling up trucks so full that it's kind of like, you're inefficiently running around trying to find freight to put on the truck. There is a place where you just kind of give up on trailer utilization and instead focus more on that cost per pound. So both of those work in tandem with each other. So one example, it's kind of fun to think about. We call it the beer and pretzels example. So how could 90% of a truck and 88% of a truck equal 100% of a truck? It's not a trick question, believe it or not. So we call it beer and pretzels because we're talking about literally, combining beer and pretzels on one truck. So something that's very heavy, very dense, doesn't take up a lot of room. So like beer, for example. You can weigh out a truck very quickly. You can put a truck overweight a lot quicker than you can fill it volume-wise, right, with beer. So in this example, you've got about 90% based on weight. And then pretzels are very light, right? They're not very dense. So they take up a lot of room, but they don't weigh a whole lot, right? So in this case, you're at 88% based on the volume of space on the truck. So what's really cool is if you can combine those two items or two items like this on the same truck, and suddenly together you are at 100% of your weight and 100% of your volume, right? This is like dream scenario. I've seen it happen very few times, but it's a goal that you should always shoot for when you're on the transportation design side. So a good example, I mentioned that foam earlier. We actually brought steel in for the trailers, the boat trailers, on the same truck as the foam, right? So suddenly all that foam that takes up space kind of gets a free ride because we've weighed out a truck with very heavy steel coming into the plant next door. So you're looking for examples like this to kind of combine things. I'm not going to give you a question where you have to calculate what's the optimal, right? I'm not going to do that on the exam. I'm just kind of exposing you guys to other metrics that you might consider along with the basic trailer utilization. So really quick on metrics strategies. First thing, obviously, determine the critical metrics. Like, what do we care about? Seems really simple. A lot of folks will disagree about that. So you have to come together as an organization on it. Watch for unintended consequences. This is probably the best advice I can offer you when it comes to metrics. as soon as you say, thing A is important to me, everyone will abandon things B through C or Z, right? They'll let them go. Like, okay, you tell me that A is important, I will focus on A. I will do everything I can to make A a reality, right? Even if that means sacrificing B, C, D, or E, right? Okay, you tell me quality is really important. Awesome, great. Guess what? Our costs are going through the roof. Oh, you tell me cost is important? Okay, customer service is going to go, like, we're just going to lose it, right? Like, there's going to be no customers left because we're going to focus on cost, or quality is going to suffer because we're going to focus on cost, right? So you have to always be aware of the other consequences of the metrics that you choose. Best case scenario, you measure across more than one at a time. Come up with a measurement system. How are we going to come up with these numbers? I've seen entire meetings devolve into, well, how did you come up with this number? I don't know if we agreed upon this. I'm going to challenge how you calculated it. Like, okay, before the meetings start, we're going to agree that every time we come in with this metric to review it, we're going to not talk about how it was calculated, because we're going to agree on that ahead of time, right? That's a crucial piece of it. Post them visually. That year-long project I was telling you all about, the second week, we built a dashboard and put it up on a big projector on the wall. Everyone knew about it. Suddenly, we knew the score to the game. Suddenly, our perception of what was happening in the office was right in line with the reality of what was happening. Explain them to the team. There's very few things more frightening to a team than getting told, like, well, your performance is going to be based on this metric, and just putting it on the wall and not ever really explaining it to them, how it works, how it's calculated, how they impact it. Give your team, do them the service and show them the respect of highlighting those things to them, so that they can then, turn on their brain, which you're paying them a lot of money to use, right? And help you improve those metrics, because that's really what you're all after, right? You have to update them regularly. I walked into many, we call them war rooms in the supply chain industry. You walk into a big conference room with like thousands of graphs on the wall, and you're looking around the wall like, wow, these are from 2011, right? Like, that happened all the time, right? Like, oh my gosh. So these metrics were important enough at some point for someone to print them out, make the dashboards, all that. But now you're not even updating them, right? So as soon as you give up on them, your team will give up on them as well, and they'll lose interest. Reduce the information lead time. So, the goal would be somebody on your team makes a decision, and then that's reflected in the metric basically as soon as possible. The closer you can get to real time, the more accurate those measurements are, but also the more your team will learn, hey, these tweaks I'm making are having a positive or a negative result on our metric. That is so powerful. If that is the critical metric that your company's driving for, why would you not want your team to understand how they're impacting it, right? So the closer to real time you can get with that, obviously the better. And this last one here, hopefully I've kind of let you guys see some of my management style, and I hope this comes through clearly. It's really easy to become a dictator with metrics and hold them over people's heads, and like, why did you screw up, all that. And hopefully you've learned this on the lean side as well, with your lean certification that you're doing. Problems are not people-based. Problems are process-based, right? Don't allow one of your employees to get their identity entirely taken up with a number, right? That's a terrible place to end up. The goal is for them to feel responsible and equipped to help deal with that number. But under all of that, when you go back and say, man, the number went up and we wanted it to go down, what happened? Make sure you're blaming the processes involved and not the people. The second you start blaming people, everyone gets defensive, everyone locks up, you'll get no new ideas, people will not like coming to work, people will get frustrated, they'll turn on each other. It's a terrible dynamic, right? It doesn't build a good, healthy culture, which is certainly what you're after. So absolutely, implementing metrics is powerful. It can be good, but there's also kind of a dark side to it. Just make sure it doesn't go there. if you're responsible for the team, make sure the team knows, like, you are more than these numbers that we're putting out, but I'm asking you to help us solve these numbers, right? That's kind of the goal at a high level of using metrics and visual management.